It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Damian Green, Labour MP Stella Creasy, Guardian Chief Political Correspondent Jessica Elgert, and from the free market think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, Annabel Denham. Today, these are the scenes in Moscow as Vladimir Putin claims his troops in Ukraine are defending the motherland. The Defence Secretary says this.
Through their invasion of Ukraine, Putin, his inner circle and his generals are now mirroring fascism and tyranny of 77 years ago.
Mr Starmer, will you resign, sir?
Keir Starmer cancels an appearance as questions over his lockdown curry with beer continue.
The idea that Keir is somehow ducking scrutiny is simply not true.
It was planned, wasn't it? Well, Boris Johnson, Keir Starmer said...
It's planned that he will eat and he doesn't live on fresh air.
Is there a plan to fix post-Brexit trade rules in Northern Ireland?
We'll be taking forward further action. I mean, ultimately, nothing is off the table, but we need to fix Northern Ireland Protocol.
And after last week's election losses, are the Conservatives experiencing southern discomfort? Let's start with those scenes in Moscow. Russia's annual Victory Day. You can see here a grand display of military might on full show, with the Russian army marching through Red Square to mark Soviet victory over Nazi Germany in 1945. Vladimir Putin has said and compared it, the Soviet-era fight against fascism, with Russia's current invasion of Ukraine. The grim reality on the ground, as you can see here, has been and continues to be an assault on Ukraine, unprovoked assault on Ukraine, with devastation wrought on the country and its people. Cities like Mariupol, here, you've just heard the explosion, which have effectively been razed to the ground. And, of course, most recently, hundreds of civilians trapped underneath the steelworks. Just to start the programme, Damian Green, what's your impression of what you've seen?
Well, I mean, my impression is everyone's impression of what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. It's disgusting, it's barbaric, it's war crimes, it's bombing civilians regularly. And, I mean, it's always struck me that this parade is a sign of weird insecurity. The Americans don't have a similar parade. We don't have a similar parade. We have Remembrance Day where we march veterans. We don't parade weapons. So there is something slightly odd about the parade anyway. This year, of course, it's particularly disgusting because we know what those weapons are being used for in real life, which is to kill civilians.
Stella, the contrast between the two, these victory parades, this show of military might and the devastation in cities across Ukraine like Mariupol.
Yeah, and I think you're right to draw the contrast. But I thought also it was quite interesting about this that we're still looking at the translations of what was said, but actually it's what wasn't said, I think, is quite interesting about this, where Putin, clearly this war has not gone the way he expected it to go. Clearly, we are now possibly looking at something that could go on as long as Afghanistan if there isn't a diplomatic intervention. And actually, he didn't talk about an escalation. I don't think that's what's coming out of the translation.
No, there hasn't been so far.
Which does suggest that he recognises that actually for the Russian public, this is an increasingly uncomfortable position to be in. And he's got to do these kind of propaganda wars to try and prove to them that they are still the strong motherland. But actually, the word is starting to get through about the horrors that are being committed in their name and the fact that actually the Ukrainian people are standing up to them, the world is standing with Ukraine, and this isn't going Russia's way. I thought that was quite interesting that they didn't see the same level of rhetoric and language that we might have seen at the start of the campaign, and whether that tells us that there is hope that we could get a diplomatic solution to this.
We saw Ben Wallace there, the Defence Secretary, in the headlines. What has been the message today from him and the government?
Well, I think that Ben Wallace probably drew some of the right comparisons, having World War II veterans standing next to Putin when, Russia's essentially committing sort of acts of fascism in Ukraine, and also, he talked about these kind of manicured generals in their uniforms standing next to Putin when these are the people whose tactics in Ukraine have proven to be overwhelmingly terrible and have not had the advances that Putin would have liked to have announced today. I think that's, it sort of shows it up for what it is, almost comic to have this terrible parade of weaponry when things have gone so badly wrong for him.
Annabelle, picking up on what Stella has said about what was and wasn't said in what was quite a brief speech, actually, by Vladimir Putin addressing the thousands of soldiers gathered there in Red Square, not actually moving on from this special military operation, which wasn't mentioned in those terms, to a grand escalation of war.
No, and I think a lot of people were expecting that he would issue a formal declaration of war and national mobilisation, but essentially he's repeated, as far as we're aware, what he's said over the last year or so, and that is a surprise because they're not close to getting a decisive victory in the Donbass. The troop losses are mounting and things are starting to look pretty bad for Putin, and I think if they don't improve by, let's say, June, then he's going to have little choice but to dig in and sit down and stop the offensive action, at least temporarily. All
right, let's talk about Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, and what's been dubbed Beergate, by showing you a front page of the Daily Mail. The headline says, "Rattled Starmer snubs the chance to clear air." The Labour Party has cancelled an appearance by Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, today. He was going to be making a speech to the Institute for Government with questions, no doubt awkward ones, from journalists. This follows Durham Police decision over the weekend, on Friday, actually, to open an investigation into whether lockdown rules were breached and broken at a campaign visit by Keir Starmer in 2021. Now, the response from the Labour Party has been to that cancellation, plans change. But, Jess, Keir Starmer has found himself in a really tricky situation over this, hasn't he?
Yeah, he certainly has. And I think that, I understand this morning they are seriously considering whether he should come out on the front foot and say that he's going to resign if he's found to have broken it. Firstly, I think because that would obviously put some pressure on the Conservatives and on the PM. But secondly, because obviously it feels like there's almost no choice in that regard. Keir Starmer has, and probably people thought this was the right way to play it because of his personality, held himself up as like the kind of moral, decent alternative to Boris Johnson. That's the strength he plays on because he doesn't necessarily beat him as on the charisma front. But I think that, one of the reasons why he's going to have to do that is because if you hold yourself up to that standard, it's very difficult to see how you go beyond that without having to resign if you are found to have broken some of the same rules.
I mean, Stella, let's remind viewers and our guests here about what Keir Starmer said initially in response to questions about what happened on that campaign visit. I was in a constituency office just days before the election. We were very busy. We were working in the office. We stopped for something to eat and then we carried on working. No party, no breach of the rules. But since then, far more details have emerged which show, at the very least, that Keir Starmer has been less than open and transparent about what took place.
If it had been up to me, I would have actually published this memo that's come out at this weekend because that exactly proves what Keir said, that they actually planned, because they were in the middle of a by-election campaign, they planned for the work they were going to do, they planned for it to be COVID secure, and they planned to eat. And I think what's really telling to me about all of this, and I don't know whether it's the same experience you've had, Damien, is that when all the stories about the 16 parties at Downing Street came out, I was deluged with emails. I was stopped on the street. I was at the football at Leyton Orient with people who said, I'm a lifelong Conservative, but this is outrageous and Boris has had to go. Genuinely, and I checked this morning so that I could tell the truth, I've not had a single email about this to do with Keir, because I think the public see him, as Jess says, for rightly what he is, as a man of principle.
So do the principles not matter? Never mind whether or not you've had constituency letters about it. But actually, let me just point out some of the discrepancies, because there are now claims and reports that no work was done after eating this takeaway curry, that it was a pretty big gathering with other people joining. So not just the activists and people who were there. They were drinking beer, getting tipsy. Can that reasonably be described as necessary for work purposes, which are what the rules are?
We're talking about a by-election. I don't know anybody who's worked in a by-election who goes home at 7 o'clock in the evening. The whole point about by-elections, I mean, you're lucky if you leave at 1 o'clock in the morning, especially in your run-up to the final days, when you're doing a lot of planning. So the idea that the work didn't continue doesn't ring true to me at all. If they were drinking beer, I can imagine they were drinking beer with a curry. People do that. Yeah. It's been a long time since I've had a drink because I've been off having babies. But none of what they've said contradicts what that memo says or the rules. And I think that's what's so telling about all of this. And that's why I say, look, the public see this for what they is. They see this as mud.
Should he quit?
And they see
should he quit if Durham Police find that he has broken the rules?
That is a matter for Keir. But what I would say is the fact that they're also talking about this shows how confident they are that he followed the rules. Because this is a man, I mean, I have to sit in meetings with him on a weekly basis. And it's a man, as Lisa said, he self-isolated 6 times. So many things were reorganised because he was so determined that everybody would uphold the rules.
All right, well, let me judge it, because Jess mentioned it. Henry Zeffman in The Times is saying, exclusive, Keir Starmer is considering announcing that he would quit as Labour leader if found to have broken lockdown rules. Do you agree he should?
I said, I think this is a matter for Keir, because it is, as people are saying, it's a test about his principle. I'm not surprised he's looking at that. And I think the contrast with the Prime Minister who has been fined, there are repeated fines to come and there are repeated parties, and he's not even going to say anything about this, is pretty damning in terms of character. And actually, it's not just about the parties. It's about, can you trust this person? So the fact that Keir is even contemplating these things is a mark of the man's character.
Should Boris Johnson have already resigned, Damien Green, over breaking the laws he made?
No, I've said all the way along that I will come to a judgment when actually I've got all the evidence. That seems to me the rational way to behave. And I apply that to Boris, I apply it to Keir as well. I'm not going to sit here and call for Keir to resign for all the
Or is it just because it's too difficult to do that? Because then, of course, the pressure would increase on
I think,
Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak.
I think we should be consistent. And you know, Stella's already come to a verdict on Boris halfway through the investigation. She's already come to a verdict on Keir at the start of the investigation.
And that's why I've come to the conclusion.
I'm actually being consistent and actually holding to the tenets of a law-abiding society that we should do, which is evidence first, sentence afterwards.
But we've got the evidence. He broke the law. He's had a fine from the Metropolitan Police. They have concluded he's a lawbreaker.
We haven't got the full evidence yet. I want to see all of that evidence.
If he's fined again, should he resign?
Well, I'm not going to answer hypotheticals either. Let's see what all the evidence is in both cases before we decide whether anyone should resign or not. This is serious enough not to be just a sort of piece of gotcha journalism, I think.
It's not about gotcha journalism, is it? If the Metropolitan Police have issued a fixed penalty notice for breaking COVID rules to Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, when you say more evidence needs to be gathered, there's a principle at stake. You obviously don't feel the principle is enough for Boris Johnson to resign.
Well, I think the principle is that you listen to all the evidence before you come to a decision.
Well, what about the principle of breaking the law?
You want to come to a decision now when we know, and it's only going to take a few more weeks, presumably, for the police to continue or to finish this investigation, and then for Sue Gray's report to come out. Let's have a look at that.
Annabelle, there is something to be said about the scale, the difference between Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak. The Labour Party and colleagues of Stella Creases have said the scale is different. It was a culture at Downing Street. But the event itself might be compared directly to the birthday party for which Boris Johnson has been fined.
Yes, exactly. We're talking about 2 separate things here. One is the culture of drinking that dominated at number 10, the BYOB parties and the suitcases full of wine. But that's not what Keir Starmer demanded that Boris Johnson resign for. He demanded that he resign for Cakegate, with the idea that the Prime Minister was ambushed by cake at work on his birthday, which I don't think many members of the public are taking issue to. So I think the trouble that Keir Starmer has is that he's being hoisted by his own petard. This is a man who has staked his reputation on a meticulous attention to detail. He's a QC, he's a principled individual. That's what set him apart from Boris Johnson. If it's revealed that he's committed the same breach of the COVID rules, then I think his position's untenable.
I think we need to be clear. Cakegate was a birthday party organised for the Prime Minister. It was never a work event. It was organised, I think, by his wife and large members of his staff appeared. This is about campaigning during a by-election, and at what point did Keir Starmer stop to eat, and whether there were other people eating with him. It is a completely different thing, and as I say, I think the public see through this, and that's the frustration for people right now.
But he was at his place of work, and Keir Starmer's also demanded that Rishi Sunak resign for turning up early to a meeting.
He was holding a birthday party at his place of work. Keir was campaigning in a by-election and stopped to eat something at 10 o'clock at night, and then they carried on working, because that's what people do during by-elections on all political parties. They are two completely different things. I didn't have birthday parties during lockdown with my friends, or we had them on Zoom. It was not the same thing. Why didn't the Prime Minister do it on Zoom? He was going to abide by the rules that he created himself. That's why he's got a fine, and that's the problem, Damien. He has already been found to get a fine. There's no suggestion here. The police have already looked at this case once. They're looking at it again, but he hasn't had a fine. Boris has had a fine, so he's broken the rules that he wrote himself.
I'm trying hard not to be partisan here, because I do think that sort of politics should rise above this sort of thing. No, well, I'll tell you what's different. You've just said that, this memo shows that Keir is completely in the clear. If he's completely in the clear, why has he cancelled this morning's engagement? It wasn't just some casual engagement. The Institute for Government is a serious think tank where, on the eve of the Queen's speech, the Leader of the Opposition will be saying important things. It's a bit strange that he's cancelled that.
Well, he's cancelled it because he's considering whether he should say he's going to resign or not. I mean, that's the reason for it, isn't it?
All right. Stella?
Well, I just think some of this, and we're going to go on to talk about Northern Ireland, this is about a pattern of behaviour where you've got a Prime Minister that you cannot trust, a thing that he said, he's been evasive, versus a Leader of the Opposition who is so principled, he's thinking now, even though we know that he didn't break the rules and that this memo actually shows how they made plans not to break the rules.
All right.
And he's still thinking about it. It's a different mark of character, and character matters in Poland.
I mean, it's an interesting state of affairs, Jess, because politically it's going to be difficult for either of the parties to continue talking. And I mean, political parties to talk about parties and law-breaking or rule-breaking because it's a plague on all their houses.
I think that is something that's true, and I think that there are certainly some shadow cabinet ministers, I think, who think that perhaps have already thought that there perhaps was too much emphasis on this versus the cost of living crisis, where they think that Labour can make much better inroads against the Conservatives long term than on this. And this was mainly about establishing Keir's personality as an alternative to the Prime Minister.
But the Tories won't be able to talk about it either, will they?
Well, I think particularly if Starmer says that he'll resign if he gets fined, that makes things very, and especially if he goes on then to resign, it makes things very difficult for the Prime Minister indeed. Although arguably, if your opponent resigns, I don't know who's the winner there.
Well, we'll leave that question hanging for the moment and talk about the Northern Ireland and the result of those elections over the weekend. Today, the Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis will meet the leaders of Stormont's 5 main political parties, including Sinn Féin, obviously, and the Democratic Unionist Party, following Sinn Féin's election victory last week, which saw the party with the most seats. They ended up with the most seats in the Northern Ireland Assembly for the first time. But the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, has said it will not return to power sharing unless issues over the Northern Ireland Protocol, the trading arrangements post-Brexit, are dealt with, or they'd like them abolished altogether. And at the moment, we're not quite sure what the government is planning to do. Let's have a listen to Geoffrey Donaldson, leader of the DUP, who is at the election count in Belfast.
We will accept the outcome of the election. However, our position remains that we need to remove the long shadow of the protocol that is inhibiting our ability to operate and function properly within the political institutions. And the sooner that happens, the sooner we'll be in a position to move forward.
So Geoffrey Donaldson has thrown down the gauntlet to the government to change the Northern Ireland Protocol that the government agreed with the EU would be the post-Brexit trading arrangements. Do you agree with the government that it's for the EU to move on this in order to see the Democratic Unionist Party return to power sharing?
I think both sides will probably have to compromise. There are clearly issues with the protocol. And we have to find a way where safely you can allow goods going from Great Britain to Northern Ireland that are only going to Northern Ireland to be completely unchecked. It's another part of the UK. But goods that are going onto the Republic and therefore into the single market, there needs to be a way to check them. Now,
it hasn't worked, though, has it, so far? I mean, that has always been the sort of idea behind it. It hasn't worked so far.
No, it hasn't. That's why it needs to change. And I mean, to answer your question directly, I think both sides will have to move to find some kind of compromise solution. I'm told by trade experts it's not that difficult, actually, to find coding systems that could be applied that wouldn't involve any kind of border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which is clearly desirable. It's part of the UK, but would allow it to be checked if it went further on. So I don't think it's an impossible conundrum. It does require a degree of trust on both sides, which seems to be a bit lacking. But I think the stakes are so serious that in the end, I'm slightly optimistic that just as with the overall trade deal in 2019, where right up to the wire people were saying this is impossible, and actually it happened, I suspect we will have weeks and weeks of sound and fury, but actually a deal at the end of it.
Do you agree the EU has to move, Stella? I mean, we've heard the European Commission Vice President, Maros Sefcovic, who is the chief negotiator here. We've already shown a lot of flexibility. We need the UK government to dial down the rhetoric and be honest about the deal they signed and agree to find solution within its framework.
And I don't think that's an unfair critique to make. I mean, that's a challenge here, and I agree with you that trust is the matter. The problem is you've got a Prime Minister who's spending all his time screaming and shouting about Brexit and screaming and shouting at our European counterparts on a range of issues, and then expecting them to think that you can have the negotiation that we do need to have to make this work.
But does that sound intransigent by the EU?
No, it sounds like what is happening, which is the EU is going, well, hold on a minute. And they said they've got no desire to interfere in internal UK matters. That's what Mario said. And you've still got Dominic Raab saying, we don't care what the EU says, we're going to do this unilaterally. It's not a great place to be for a treaty that they negotiated, that the Prime Minister himself was involved in negotiating. And they knew that it was an impossible circle to square. So they knew that something was going to have to give. And the question is, what is going to have to give? Because it's too important to the people of Northern Ireland who didn't vote for this and didn't vote for the protocol to let them down in the way that now this kind of posturing and this idea of unilaterally tearing up an international trade treaty, which is what Liz Truss is talking
let Damien
about.
respond.
It's a mess. And it's a mess of the government's own making, isn't it, Damien?
No, your characterisation of what Dominic Raab said is deeply unfair. Everyone agrees
talk about unilateral
it would be
movement,
better to do it as part of a negotiation, as the original trade and cooperation agreement was done. So everyone would prefer that way. And I think there will be rhetoric on both sides. I think to say all the rhetoric comes from the British government side and none of it comes from the EU side is a bit one-eyed, frankly. I think both sides, as happens in international negotiations,
what do you think when Boris compared what was happening in Ukraine and the oppression of Putin to the Brexit vote? What do you think? What message did that send about our ability? We've left the European Union. I sit here as the chair of the Labour Movement for Europe. Absolutely accept that. But the idea that we don't want a good working relationship with Europe, what kind of message does it send when our Prime Minister makes that kind of comparison about our ability to work with people?
He didn't make that comparison.
Yes, he did.
But I mean, the truth is that there will be people on both sides who say things that you say in the mode of negotiation to show that you take it very seriously, and that in the end you reach a deal.
All right,
that's what we need to do.
And on that question, do you agree the EU has to move too? Otherwise, there won't be a solution.
I want the EU round the table with the British negotiators and with the people of Northern Ireland, because we've got to get it right for them. But I also want Britain to take responsibility for the deal that we negotiated under Boris Johnson, because this is a mess that we've made.
How difficult is this situation, Annabelle?
I think it's very difficult. Look, I'm no fan of the Northern Ireland Protocol. I don't see how anybody could be. I think its sole redeeming feature was that it enabled us to get a deal over the line and avoid a no-deal Brexit. But the situation at the moment cannot continue, and I think that the UK government is right to be looking at ways to bring the EU back to the negotiating table. Let's not forget that flexibility was part of the arrangement, and we need to also remember that we're only at about 30% implementation, certainly under half implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and yet it's already costing hundreds of millions of pounds every year. We had the latest PMI survey showing that Northern Ireland was underperforming other regions on a wide range of metrics, including inflation pressures. So something needs to change, and needs to change as soon as possible. And I would like to see us move towards the proposals that were set out in the command paper last July by the former Brexit Minister Lord Frost, which I think are liberalising and pragmatic proposals.
Jess?
I mean, I think it's probably fair to say that in the last 3 months, the focus of the EU has not been on this, and it's been on the crisis in Ukraine. And that is, and I think probably what we are about to see is a renewed focus on it because of this vote in Northern Ireland, and that frankly can only be a good thing, because at the moment we're at a complete impasse. I think that there is ill feeling on both sides, which has been alluded to. The other thing that's often brought up to me is when Liz Truss was first given this brief after Frost's departure, and she wrote that very hardline article in the Telegraph that instead of what some people in Brussels were hoping for, which was a bit of a reset of relations. I think, again, we're seeing a lot of hardline rhetoric ramping up, but behind the scenes, everybody wants to refine this. Everybody wants to get a new deal, and no one wants to see, the chaos of unilateral revocation.
I mean, how far do you think the government will go on this? I mean, Stella talked about Dominic Raab actually saying that the government could be, he didn't use these words, he said we will rule nothing out and we will do whatever's necessary, which can be interpreted as overriding and ripping up the Northern Ireland Protocol, the agreement they made with the EU. Could they, should they go that far?
I would very much hope we don't have to go that far. I mean, that would be not a good result at all. But it's the sort of thing people say at the start of tough negotiations. I think it's when you start interpreting every remark everyone makes during a negotiation.
Well, he is a member of the Cabinet and he was asked directly about this, and he does say, but we rule nothing out. If the protocol had been implemented in a less dogmatic, rigid way, I have to say I don't think we would have these problems.
The alternative is to say, well, we're not going to do this and we're not going to do that, and if you push us hard enough, we'll back down. Now, nobody goes into a negotiation like that. So I think, we need to be realistic about the way the world works.
So you don't think that is a serious proposition?
I think it's clearly, it has to be taken seriously because it could happen. I very, very much hope it doesn't happen.
Right. I mean, Jess, in terms of the Queen's speech, there has been some debate tomorrow that there would be a bill. We have now been told that there won't be specific legislation talking about the Northern Ireland Protocol, overriding it, changing it, but words, opaque words that would probably say something along the lines of strengthening the Good Friday Agreement. Is that what you're expecting?
Yeah, so you can't have a bill because, frankly, we haven't got a solution. So I don't know what we put in the bill if there was one. Yes, I think there's going to be recommitment. What I'm told is there's going to be words recommitting us to the Good Friday Agreement. Of course, none of that precludes actually having a bill. I mean, you can still have one if something's produced.
The measures shall be brought before you. I
think. That's the one.
Have you heard them before? You're saying.
Once or twice.
I mean, in terms of Maroš Šefčovič and the EU and their response so far, do you think they would be minded to agree to certainly dialing down the number of checks on goods that are destined for Northern Ireland rather than destined for the Republic of Ireland?
This is why we need a reset, because at some point, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar, and at some point this government has to deal with Europe as equal partners and respected partners. And all the rhetoric and this idea of talking bully boy tactics at the start somehow is going to get you a better deal when we've been through the pain and the discomfort of Brexit just doesn't ring true. But what I think is quite powerful is that even withstanding that, you've got EU negotiators saying, look, we're willing to talk because we all want to see the Northern Ireland have a solution here. So even when we are, sabre rattling, it's just, there are other ways of approaching other people that might get a better result. And I think we owe it to the people of Northern Ireland, and that's for me as somebody who wants a close working relationship with Europe. What we need to do now, we need to start talking about what we share in common and how we want to get this right for both sides.
Damien?
It is. I wasn't involved in the Brexit negotiations, so
you weren't sabre rattling.
I can only comment from the outside, but it is a fixed view inside the government that actually Stella's portrayal of the EU as being sweetly reasonable and all fine, and if you talk to them nicely, we'll all reach an agreement, is dead wrong. And actually, they are extremely tough in their own self-defence, as you would expect them to do, and that therefore you've got to be extremely tough on the other side of the table, and then you get mutual respect, and in the end you get a deal. And all I can say is that people argued for months that we wouldn't get a trade agreement with the EU, and we did. So whatever you think or say about David Frost, he negotiated that deal, and he did it fully in the knowledge that the tougher he talked, he thinks, the more likely it was to get an eventual deal. And he did.
And now we're in a position where that deal hasn't worked. The people of Northern Ireland are losing out. So it's a Pyrrhic victory at best. Perhaps another approach where actually we treat people as grown-ups would be better. The people of Northern Ireland deserve better.
Well, we can discuss negotiating tactics, but it worked, and there was no sign.
It didn't work.
All right.
It clearly didn't work.
OK, well, you're going to...
It clearly
You're going to agree to disagree on that issue. We're going to talk about the local election results. It was a bad night for the Conservatives. They lost nearly 500 seats across the UK, council seats, almost a quarter of the ones they contested. You can see pretty glum, reflective faces here. In southern England, they lost control of key councils such as Southampton, Portsmouth, Wokingham, Maidstone. And, of course, in London, they lost those 3 totemic councils of Wandsworth, Westminster and Barnet. Damien, you wrote a piece for the Sunday Telegraph. The Tories must rekindle its one nation spirit to avoid southern discomfort. Rediscovering the virtues that appeal to natural Conservatives will ensure it will avoid disaster in the blue wall, which is the term describing those seats across the south and traditional Tory areas. Do you think the government has ignored and neglected the south?
I think it's not so much neglecting the south as having too much emphasis on a group of policies that they think will appeal specifically to the new voters that switched from Labour to the Conservatives in 2019. So it's a question of emphasis. I think you need, both sides to fly effectively. And there are a group of policies, some of it about taxation and economic policy, but other things about were traditional Conservative values about good governance, about competent government, and so on, that is actually what a lot of people who sit in traditionally strong Conservative seats, who are often pillars of their own community. They may not be partisan politically, but they vote Conservative because that reflects their underlying values. And we neglect them at our peril. And it's the obverse of what Labour did for decades, quietly ignored a lot of people who would regard themselves as traditional working-class Labour voters in northern seats. And in the end, they just said, under Jeremy Corbyn, up with this, we will not put any longer, and switched en masse. And I think it's better to see the first signs of unease and deal with it then, rather than wait until you have an electoral disaster like Labour did in 2019.
Right, well, there were quite a lot of signs, weren't there, from Friday night in both the Labour and Lib Dems benefiting from your discomfort. Let's have a listen to Michael Gove, Cabinet Secretary, Levelling Up Secretary. He was talking to the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason, in a new panorama about levelling up, which is what Damien's been talking about, a key part of the Tory agenda for seats in parts of the country in the north and the Midlands. Let's have a listen.
At a time when inflation is rising, that means that every pound of government spending is worth a little bit less in a year's time than it was last year. So it is a tough climate. It's tough for everyone. It is both much more important and also that little bit more difficult.
It looks as if that focus is going to continue very much in those parts of the country.
And I'm not saying it shouldn't. I mean, because clearly levelling up is the central sort of domestic policy of this government post-COVID, and it should be. But what I'm saying is that in other areas of policy, think what is this going to? How is this going to play in Kent and Surrey and Sussex and so on?
Well, what do constituents, your constituents, think about levelling up and the government's relentless focus on it?
They absolutely get, because, as I say, they are decent people and they accept there are communities that have been left behind for decades.
But they voted against the Conservatives in as far as...
I think they weren't doing that as a protest against levelling up.
No, but against the government's direction of travel.
No, well, the direction of travel, it wasn't so much that. I think it was the sort of mode of expression that they were objecting to the feeling that there is a sort of some air of chaos at the centre of things going back and forth. What they expect from a Conservative government is sort of solid economic policy, bearing down on public spending, bearing down on taxes, and at the same time a proper concentration on the big public services that help people. And that's what they want.
Right. Jess, do you think voters in the south are feeling neglected and ignored?
Yes, I think so. I've been really surprised over the weekend that there isn't sort of more worry from Conservative MPs that I've seen. I mean, losing 500 council seats is definitely at the top end of the expectations of what they had. Labour being ahead on, all these measures like economic competence, even I think on immigration, which is, extraordinary when it comes to, how the Jeremy Corbyn's leadership was seen. And yet you still, and predictions that the Tories could lose up to 122 seats if this was reflected across the country at the next election. Yet every Tory MP that I speak to seems incredibly blasé about the fact that they win the next easily win the next election, and that that there's
not
even if they but I mean, I genuinely have found it extraordinary that there's this level of kind of complacency and ease, and it does make me wonder whether the Tories have got so used to winning, and I'm not ruling out the fact that Tories could win the next election, far from it, that they can't see something heading for them.
Damien?
Well, I'm worried that you say that, because I obviously had lots of messages over the weekend from colleagues saying good stuff, sort of thing. So I can tell you there is more than me that's worried. But your underlying analysis is right. Of course, the next election is up for grabs, actually, looking at these results objectively, because Labour hasn't achieved a breakthrough and we don't know how much of it is just a midterm protest and all of that. So absolutely it's up for grabs. So what I'm trying to do is set a sort of stake in the ground saying let's not sort of carry on, or let's not think that we can take these people for granted.
Right. I mean, do you agree with the analysis from Damien, Annabelle?
What I think is that voters, when they go to the ballot box, probably don't know what they're voting for if they're ticking next to the Conservative representative. I think the Conservative Party has moved so far from traditional Conservative values of low taxes and small government and personal autonomy and individual responsibility that they're going to suffer for it inevitably when it comes to elections. Now, there's obviously a risk that we're going to read it too much into what happens in the midterms. Clearly, the Tories are suffering midterm blues. There's the cost of living crisis. We only had the inflation data out last week. The Labour Party, meanwhile, is suffering from long Corbyn. So we don't know how things are going to play out in 2 years from now. I certainly don't think the Conservative Party should be too complacent. The trouble it's got now is that Rishi Sunak raised taxes more in 3 years than Gordon Brown did in the entire time that he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. The Tory party have talked about igniting the bonfire of red tape. We've had more of that today ahead of the Queen's speech tomorrow, and yet it's introducing more and more pettifogging laws around junk food advertising, the animal sentience bill, for instance. It just goes on, and each regulation slightly limits the room for manoeuvre of individual men and women and businesses in this country, and I think that blue wall voters are really starting to feel that. But the trouble it's got is that it's going to look a little schizophrenic now if it moves back to lowering taxes, because it's just raised the next hike at the same time as saying that 2 years from now it's going to lower a very similar tax by 1 penny.
Well, on that, you think the solution is lowering taxes, don't you now?
I think, yes, in as much as there is any kind of money available, and we spent a huge sum of money rather successfully to keep the economy together during the pandemic, so that money has been spent, can't be spent again. But in as much as there is, I would rather do that by cutting taxes than any other way. But the other point I would make is that Tory voters expect tax money raised to be spent effectively, which is why I'm concerned about social care and things like that.
Well, I think all voters hope that's what happens.
We need to spend the money in a way that people will see a visible difference in that kind of area, which I'm worried about.
But this point that Annabelle has raised about not knowing, if you are a Conservative voter, what you're voting for in terms of this Conservative government party, you've been busy writing another piece, I'll cite, of yours in The Times. Tories are squandering a once-in-a-generation chance to fix social care. In the piece, you suggest that the health and social care levy might not be enough to fund social care. So you want lower taxes, but you seem to suggest that the tax rises already announced might not be enough. No, I mean that's a perfectly fair point, and I don't want to get into that because I've had various rows over the weekend with politicians on the left who just say what we need to do is to tax less and spend this and that. I think the problem with the health and care levy, of which the government has taken political flack, not least from people like Annabelle, actually is that not enough of it will be spent on social care. I'm not saying raise more money. I'm saying that more of it should be spent as soon as possible in the social care system. But I'm also saying that you need to make other changes as well, for the workforce and for integrating it with the NHS. I'm not sure how that assessment works, Annabelle, in terms of not having more money somehow, getting it either from taxes or I don't know where else from.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've been saying this for years, but there is no magic money tree, and it's all very well saying that the money that we borrowed to deal with the pandemic is money spent and money spent well, but let's not forget that we massively increased the supply of money, the amount of money going into the UK economy, and that's why we're now seeing such high rates of inflation. Inflation is set to hit double digits later this year, and the problem the Conservatives have is that in a year from now, people are going to feel a lot poorer than they do currently. Now, I agree that there are global supply chain issues. We do have globally too much money chasing too few goods, and that's driving up inflation as well. But a big problem is that the Bank of England has been printing money for the last 2 years,
that was for the pandemic,
particularly in 2020, and the government cannot print more money, but it also can't continue to raise taxes. We are at or close to our taxable limit. So.
Damien? I was just going to make the simple point that our inflation is about the same as EU inflation. It's about the same as US inflation. I don't think the Bank of England took inflation seriously enough, early enough. But I think to blame the Bank of England, to blame domestic policy for what is a worldwide phenomenon, it doesn't wash.
All right, let's talk about Labour's part in these elections. It was a good set, certainly, for Labour in London. They are now the dominant force. They were already dominant before and trending towards taking over pretty much all parts of the capital. Stella, of course, you are one of the London MPs. Do you worry, though, that your strength in London could also be seen as a weakness more widely, that the party is being sort of characterised? We can see Labour supporters obviously delighted by those wins in those former Tory councils, but culturally that the success of Labour is being very much defined by big metropolitan areas with high numbers of university graduates, and you've got to build a coalition to win a majority.
So that is perfectly true. We have to build a coalition. But the thing you didn't mention in your roundup, which I think should frankly be worrying Conservative MPs, is how well we did in Scotland. Because actually in Scotland, which
from a very, very low base, you overtook the Conservatives.
Very high. We've won in places that we've never won before. And actually, one of the reasons why the Red Wall became such a big thing at the 2019 election was because the capacity of Labour to win in Scotland.
But you made no dents in the SNP, who are actually the ones who are dominant in Scotland.
I mean, places like Glasgow. So the idea that if you're thinking about the next general election,
I'm talking about the characterisation of Labour. Well, we've talked. And that may be so. And Anna Sarwar has said that's a turning point.
If I were Damien, I would be thinking and talking to my colleagues about. You are absolutely right to say we have got work to do. Do I regret? Do I regret winning Westminster? Are you mad?
No, I'm not asking if you regretted a win. No one said that. No one said that. But if you are, in the end, building up even more support in areas where you are already very successful, that is not going to help you.
I think this is the thing that all parties do, is how you tell the story about how you are not just an opposition, but you're an alternative. Because actually, the changes that you would make, whether it's the way in which you deal with the tax system, the way you'll deal with social care, with our healthcare service, will benefit whether it's kids in Walthamstow, kids in Workington, or kids in the West End of Glasgow. And that is the challenge for a UK-wide political party. It is a challenge that we accept with relish. Those results show that we are turning things around, that we are winning in places that people said that we would never win again, and that we're winning back places in the Red Wall. We have work to do.
Where are you winning back? Where are you winning back places in the Red Wall?
So in Cumbria, up in
yes,
Workington,
all right, that was one.
Would have said,
but overall, if you compare, if you compare the vote share with the last time those seats were contested, and I take your point that new authority that was created, Labour did take it in Cumbria, you have progressed 0.04%.
So we have made progress. We've not made as much progress as we want to. No, that's fair to say.
It's slow, isn't it?
But are you telling me that you don't think the Labour movement is in a better place now than it was?
But I didn't posit. I didn't posit that. You said you're taking back the Red Wall or parts of the Red Wall.
No, I said we have work to do. I said that at the start. But we're going in the right direction. And what I'm also saying is, if you're looking at the electoral coalition you need to win an election, don't stop. We discount Scotland at our peril.
Damien?
If I were trying to look objectively at the Labour Party's results, I'd be very worried about the Midlands, where actually we went forward in quite a lot of places, and certainly we held Council, Dudley, Redditch, places like that.
Right, but you would accept that London, disaster.
Yes, and I think that's a long-term real difficulty for the Conservative Party, because London is a hugely successful global city which has got a lot of ambitious, successful people in it who ought to be voting for a centre-right party.
Jess?
Ultimately, what does Labour have to do to win the next election? They have to win a coalition of all three of them. They have to win parts of the Red Wall, but probably they won't win all of it back. They'll have to win some of the new seats where their Labour can win for the first time, maybe places like Worthing, in order to, where younger people, university-educated people are moving on, and parts of Scotland. And they're making progress to all that, but they're not showing they can quite do it.
That's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests. And we mentioned Chris Mason's Panorama. You can watch it this evening on BBC One at 8 o'clock. I'll be back tomorrow at 12:15 with more Politics Live.